Hello. This is the Fiction Nonfiction podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your Twitter feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Vivi Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Love Marriage.
And I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
So Whit, I know you used to record this show from your childhood bedroom and that your parents live near you, and I'm wondering, when was the last time you hugged them?
I mean, it has to be early March, probably. They do live in the house that I grew up in. It's only a few blocks from where I'm sitting right now. So I do see them. We got to go, like it was Father's Day. We did a thing in the backyard where we were masked and sort of socially distant from my parents, but I don't touch them. What about you?
Well, my parents live on the East Coast, so I haven't hugged them in longer than I really want to calculate. And I've been trying to figure out how to see them, but so far I can't come up with any safe answers. And my dad is a retired pulmonologist, actually, so it's been really interesting to talk to him about the pandemic and about the virus. And my parents have been really cautious. And now I feel like they're trying to convince me, they actually said this to me, FaceTime is pretty close to being in person, but that's just lies.
Yeah, my mom is not buying that. She has this idea that she told me that she's imagining making like an entirely plastic like suit to wear so that she could like put my kids in her lap, her other grandkids, but I don't know. My dad's in his mid 80s. My mom's younger than him by almost a decade, but my dad's in his mid 80s. So is my father-in-law. I have a great aunt who's in her mid 90s, and so some of my older relatives are starting to say things like, why are we doing this? We don't have that many years left. I'm speaking in their sort of general voice, and we weren't expecting the last years of our lives to be as lonely and isolating as this, and be separate from our grandkids.
Yeah, this seems like a quality of life issue that some doctors are writing about now. Which risks should we take? And there's been some interesting risk ranking. And given the possible duration of this thing and what people are beginning to understand about that, a lot of people's tolerance for risk is shifting in different ways. And those conversations and how they affect our emotional lives keeps changing. And I feel like I kind of can't keep up.
We'll have plenty of time to talk about that today because our episode is about the first/second/ongoing forest fire of COVID-19 in America. Both our guests are doctors and writers. Later in the show, we'll be joined by the poet and physician C. Dale Young. But first, we're delighted to be joined by Daniela Lamas. Daniela is a pulmonary and critical care physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, an instructor in medicine at Harvard Medical School, and associate faculty at Ariadne Labs, where she works with the Serious Illness Care Program. She's the author of the 2018 book, You Can Stop Humming Now, a doctor's stories of life, death, and in between, as well as several New York Times op-eds about COVID-19. She is also a staff writer for the 20th Century Fox medical TV drama, The Resident. Daniela, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So Daniela, you've been treating COVID patients and writing about the pandemic for the Times basically since the beginning. And we're recording this episode on Saturday, June 26th. And as of about now, according to the Times, there have been more than 2.4 million confirmed COVID-19 cases, more than 125,000 deaths in the US. And originally, we thought of this episode as being about the second wave of the coronavirus. That was kind of our internal headline for it. But about a week ago, Michael Osterholm, the ever-quoted Michael Osterholm of the University of Minnesota's Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, said he thinks it's more like a forest fire. So I'm curious about what you think.
So I think that that term is very apt. I myself had framed my own kind of experience of COVID in this idea of, all right, we had the surge in Boston, and now the surge has ended. Our numbers are vastly lower. We've closed most of our coronavirus units here in Boston at my hospital. But then, you open up the news, and my family lives in Miami, and you look at what's going on, and you realize that, outside of this particular experience that I've had that's shared by those in New York in terms of the timing of the surge and then the decrease in numbers, throughout the rest of the country, that's not the case at all. Really, if we look at numbers of the entire country in terms of cases, we didn't really drop significantly. We just changed where those cases are. And so this idea of a forest fire that's sort of tearing through and taking down anyone, anywhere that is vulnerable, any areas that are vulnerable, I think is really a sort of devastating, but also more accurate way to look at it. And I think it allows us, or requires us actually, not to say, okay, we're unscathed, we're in the clear. Well, no, because it could come back to us because we're still vulnerable.
Well, I mean, the point of view from Kansas City, you know, was that we really didn't have hardly any cases, and it was very low. We didn't have much of a peak, but I have been watching for the last 2 weeks, you know, steadily every day, you know, those numbers are going up. People have been asking, like, there is an issue about, like, first of all, there's like what percentage of people tested are coming up positive. That is also important because there's this argument that the administration is still advancing stupidly, that it's only just that we're doing more tests is the difference, but that clearly doesn't seem to be the case. But also maybe you could talk a little bit about the declining death rate and how that relates to what's going on.
Yeah. I mean, I think all of these numbers that we're tossing around and these different metrics really bring home the fact that this virus is so hard for us as people to respond to. You know, like if you think about sort of behavioral economics and how we think about risk and what drives us, this is a virus where we don't see the effects of the good things that we do or the bad things that we do for weeks at least. And we personally, an individual, might never see the effects of the bad things. And I'm saying bad things. It's not sort of good or bad. It's not that black or white.
Like the thing I did that caused me to get COVID, the time I got exposed. We don't know when that happened, you know.
Or maybe you got exposed, but then you are only asymptomatic or very mild symptoms, but it's actually like somebody's grandmother who got sick because of that time that you were at a bar. And you can't tell that. And that's so hard to make that decision as a person, to say, I'm going to make the decision not to go to a bar to keep a person I don't know, to keep their grandmother safe. And I think that is
well, I can
really
make
hard.
a decision not to go to a bar for lots of reasons. In fact, I almost always make that decision now that I'm in my 50s. But you know, other people feel differently.
And which is why I think, you know, our overall leaders and those who make decisions, that we shouldn't have the option of doing something that is unsafe and known to be unsafe and is unnecessary. Like bars should not be open. It is not safe. To answer the question about the death rate, I mean, the death rate lags. So between the time that somebody gets coronavirus and dies, that can be as long as weeks. You can be 5 to sort of 7 to 10 days before you get bad symptoms. Then at that point, you go to a hospital. Doctors, we can keep you alive for weeks and weeks on a ventilator and on our machines, hoping that you get better. So the lag that we see now, the decrease in death rate, is really a statement about activities that happened weeks and weeks ago.
I feel like it's like watching the whole nation, and I realize this is a flawed study for a variety of reasons. It's like watching the whole nation eat the marshmallow.
Yes. Yeah. And that's entirely. And that just gets to,
I'm sorry, I didn't get that one at first. Now you're referring to that experiment.
Yeah. So for our listeners who might not recall this, there was a study years and years ago, which is oft quoted, about, you know, the kid who, with a marshmallow in front of them, promised like 3 marshmallows later, can manage not to eat the marshmallow. And then, you know, other kids who eat the marshmallow in front of them, regardless of what they're promised later.
I have a lot of friends on Facebook who have eaten the marshmallow and are really pissed at anyone criticizing them for eating the marshmallow. Like, damn it, I had a right to eat that marshmallow. What are you talking about?
Well, not only do they want to eat the marshmallow, they want to like smear marshmallow fluff all over everyone else. And it's, I mean, and you're also talking about the long duration, which we'll get to a little bit later, but, you know, one of your expertises is critical care and end of life care, which you've written a lot about. And since the start of the pandemic, it seems like the experience of end of life care, and for both the patient and the physician view, has changed a lot. Can you talk a little bit about that?
For sure. I think before COVID, and, you know, even since I trained, which isn't that long ago, we've really had like big moves toward having family in the ICU at the end of life and really involving family. We even sometimes, if it seems appropriate, if a patient is coding, if they're in cardiac arrest and we're doing CPR and the family is around, we ask them, do you want to be in the room for this? Because there's a little data about the fact that actually decreases post-traumatic stress for families afterwards, seeing that we tried everything, seeing that, you know, we did everything possible for a loved one. We ideally don't want deaths to end in cardiac arrest. We, you know, ideally, if somebody is dying, we want it to sort of be a more dignified, peaceful process if it's something that we can know ahead of time and is unavoidable. But we have families at that bedside, and now that's gone. we know facts that we did not know before, little things that an iPad fits very nicely in a biohazard bag, and that you can hold that iPad up to a patient's face and have a family say goodbye on Zoom, which is weird and terrible. And in the height of the pandemic here, that is how people died. Our hospital has relaxed the rules somewhat, so now you can have a family in at the time of death, or in the most relaxed version more recently, up to 72 hours before a patient dies, as though we're able to prognosticate that exactly. But there's all the weeks before death, all of the time that this patient spends sick. The family gets updates on the phone still, and that is very lonely. It's very isolating, and it really cuts them out of all this really valuable time that they have. And that's been it's been one of these really powerful, sort of unanticipated, and I think long-lasting consequences of this pandemic.
This is one of those things, and this is why we're talking to you now, because of what you've written about this, that I think people are failing to imagine. And I also want to just close the loop on that, the lagging death statistics, right? Mm-hmm. Which means that we don't know that it's not going to go back up. A lot of people are saying, I hear people saying, well, it's because younger people are getting infected and so it's going to be fine. But I am not at all convinced that anyone knows that the death rate is going to continue to go down like it is, or stay at 800 instead of go back to 2000 like it was at some point.
And something we're going to talk about, I think, a little bit later also is that the fact that looking at the death rate as the only marker of success or failures is pretty limited, right? Like, yes, a young person who gets COVID, are they less likely to die with really good critical care? Sure, yes, I would say they're less likely to die than an older person or a person with significant comorbidities. That being said, there's a broad range between being okay and dying. And we can have we can have thousands of people who are young and trached and on a vent in long-term care hoping to get home, and that's not okay either, even if they didn't die. We
don't have like a national department of grief. Although mm-hmm. people are often describing, it's interesting to me that it frequently comes up in description of Joe Biden, like he's really good at grief, that's his thing, but are there things that American society and even also the medical profession could be doing to support the way that Americans are going to have to deal with the way that they're dying of this disease and the way that we're experiencing grief, across this nation now?
And I think recognizing it is one thing that is sort of simple, and maybe it doesn't sound that useful, but is important. We, even before coronavirus, I worked in a really sad ICU, so it's affiliated with our cancer center here in Boston, and so we had a lot of deaths. And the day before we started getting a bunch of COVID patients, there was a 24-hour period where we had 4 entirely non-COVID, 2 were cancer, 2 were other deaths. And it was a really busy, awful day. And we didn't take any time to debrief. And it took me about an entire week until I realized, like, my God, my residents were just through 4 patients who died, 2 of them by codes. And now we have a bunch of COVID patients, and they're devastated. And so in the morning we had death rounds, which essentially we just talked about these patients who had died and the way we were feeling about it. And all of us kind of wished we had done something differently, although there wasn't clearly anything we could have done. It was all sort of unavoidable. We had done good medicine. But I think that there was some way patients remained dead. It didn't fix anything, but there was some way in which that was helpful, and sort of as a nation have a collective death rounds or, grief loss rounds. I don't know what that means, but
well, I think that's our business. We're in the book, you're in the narrative writing business. I think you're that's right. Where that comes in certain ways.
Yeah, I think that entirely makes sense. And to sort of recognize that there isn't like a hierarchy of these losses, even if you haven't lost someone to COVID, even if you haven't been in the hospital, like you've been at home and you haven't seen people that you love, and, many people have lost jobs. And so everyone is aware of like the precarious nature of what we built and of what we thought was just taken for granted before all of this.
I also wonder about the ways that American individuality plays into this. I feel like I see a series of strange paradoxes where, we're so obsessed with individual rights in this country. We have a real inability to talk about collective needs, what communities might need in the scope of American history. And, we're seeing some reckoning with this now related to George Floyd and those protests, increased conversations about Indigenous people. But, right, some of the resistance, that optimism that we're talking about is a really individual and false optimism. And so we don't have this ability to contend with the need for other people. We don't have ability to articulate a need for other people, which is really, that desire to go to the bar. To some extent, isn't that what it is? But Americans are not supposed to talk about needing other people. And the desire to, I feel like our empathy has been slowly drained away from us, the ability to imagine other people, because, as you manage to pay someone else a low wage, or not care about whether they have healthcare, or not care about whether they have to walk by a Confederate statue, like all of those things are sucking away your ability to care about the person you don't know. And so I find it really weird. Because right, in all of these other countries where, there's so-called, socialism or even just different forms of democracy, they seem to be doing a much better job of this, and to be better prepared for it.
Yeah, I mean, that gives me chills. That's so true. It's that we live in a state where essentially to exist, like we have learned to look away in some way, and now we're being asked, we have to not look away because we are literally all interconnected. And that individualism, there is this, like, we want two things. We want to be safe, but we want to also be free, like protect me, but also leave me alone. And in order to be safe, you can't say, leave me alone. Like, you gotta wear that mask. You have to do what we all know we have to do.
So we were talking a little bit about, the long afterlife. I don't even know that afterlife is the right word, but the long duration, maybe just of novel coronavirus. And you've written not only about the end of life care, but I think one of your essays that was most interesting to me is about the long and extremely variable kind of rehab and after effects. And that seems like another American thing that we have a hard time imagining, because we just sort of imagine like living every minute to the fullest. And like, what is that, the stereotype of that mean? I'm not suggesting that people with, physical after effects of coronavirus aren't going to live full lives, but the shape of that might be different. And I wonder if you could read a little bit from that piece for us, and I'd love to talk to you about it.
Sure. So the context of this piece is that I do some work in a long-term acute care hospital, even before coronavirus. So a hospital where people who've been sick enough to need ventilators and then got better enough that they could leave the ICU, but not better enough such that they were able to go home or exist without a ventilator, would be connected to a vent by something called a tracheostomy tube, a sort of hole in the neck where a tube goes in that offers a longer-term connection to the ventilator that allows them ideally to get strong enough to get off the vent. And so it's a long preface.
Can I just say that is, I so don't like that. That's so terrifying to me. The physical nature of that description. Like, I wanted to stop there for a minute and say, like, the imagining being in that situation is extremely frightening for me.
I mean, it's not something to blow through, and I did essentially. It's a big deal. It's a big inflection point in people's care, and having a trach and being connected to a vent means you largely don't go home. And it also means you're largely like not out there in the world, which means you're not seen, which means that these after effects are not really seen. We think of the ICU as having one of two conclusions: alive, and alive looks like bells and whistles, exciting music, going home, resuming your life as it was, or death. But in fact, there is this middle. And so I will read you a little bit about a piece about that middle. At least we know how to track and treat the physical consequences of our patients' prolonged ICU stays. These outcomes are visible. More insidious are the potential psychiatric and cognitive dysfunction that some former ICU patients describe: anxiety and depression, hyperarousal, and flashbacks to delirium-induced hallucinations that are characteristic of post-traumatic stress, poor planning skills, and forgetfulness that might make it hard to remember medications or appointments. These are far trickier to screen for and to treat. Of course, it is early still, and we do not yet know the burden of these outcomes in our COVID-19 survivors. But given their protracted critical care stays and the persistent isolation that so many of them endure, these issues will be widespread. At our hospital, before the coronavirus, we built a clinic for ICU survivors. There, I worked with another critical care doctor, a psychiatrist, and a social worker to screen our patients for common post-ICU problems and to offer them referrals. Patients asked us to fill in missing details. What happened to me? How long was I on the vent? This scar, what was it from? On a few occasions, we even accompanied patients back to the intensive care unit. I remember how their expressions would shift, fear fading into relief, as they realized that this was just a place that they could now enter by choice and then leave again. We do not have rigorous studies to tell us that these clinics help our patients, and it will be hard to set them up now, with so many of us critical care doctors still doing the work of keeping our patients alive, keeping ourselves safe. I do not pretend to have the answers here, but we owe it to our survivors to try. We have come to recognize that for many patients with coronavirus, the disease follows a characteristic pattern. For them, there is an initial constellation of symptoms, fever and cough, followed by a period of improvement and then a catastrophic decline. A disease with two waves. I think of us now, as a nation, at the end of our own first wave. We breathe a bit easier. Perhaps we will be okay after all. But the second wave is coming, not of death this time, but of survival. That afternoon at the long-term care hospital, I was startled in the middle of writing my notes by an unintelligible announcement on the overhead. I turned to one of the respiratory therapists. A COVID patient is being discharged, he explained. Want to go see? We rushed down the stairs to join the group that had already gathered, all of us in scrubs and masks waiting. Someone turned the music on, and Here Comes the Sun filled the small lobby. Behind me, the patient's two adult sons radiated excitement. When they last saw their father, he could not breathe. I watched as the elevator doors opened and a nurse emerged, pushing a small man in a wheelchair. He scanned the crowd, spotted his sons, and gave us all this proud little wave, like royalty. I clapped as loud as I could for him, mouthing the song's refrain, "It's all right," behind my mask, not knowing what this virus would leave him with or what kind of life he would re-enter, but hoping the words were true.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Fiction Nonfiction podcast.
Thank you. It was an honor. You guys really made me think, which is not surprising, but thank you so much. I'll have a lot to sort of contemplate after that.
Really great to catch up with you. Thank you.
It was awesome to catch up with you. Be in touch. Stay safe.
You can check out Daniela's op-eds chronicling the pandemic in the New York Times. Thank you very much. We'll see you soon. Up next, we'd like to welcome C. Dale Young. C. Dale practices medicine full-time and teaches in the Warren Wilson College MFA program for writers. He's the author of a novel and stories, The Affliction, published in 2018, and 4 collections of poetry, the most recent being his 2016 collection titled The Halo. His poetry and short fiction have appeared in many anthologies and magazines, including Best American Poetry, Asian American Poetry, The Next Generation, American Poetry Review, The Atlantic Monthly, The Nation, The New Republic, The Paris Review, and Poetry. He is also a radiation oncologist and currently lives and practices medicine in San Francisco. C. Dale, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
We're super happy to have you on the show, C. Dale. Whitney and I are both located in the Midwest, but we've been talking just now to Daniela Lamas, who works in the Boston area. You're in San Francisco, so can you tell us about the West Coast view of the pandemic these days?
Well, I don't know that I can speak to the West Coast in general, but I can definitely speak to the Bay Area. And, you know, one of the things is we were the very first to quote unquote lock down, and we have not significantly reopened actually. And it's been interesting to see the changes. First, people saying things like, of course, San Francisco's locking down, they're crazy. To, oh my God, we need to lock down, to, oh, we need to reopen and we're still locked down. But I think that, you know, California followed as a state our lead about 3 or 4 days after we went to shelter in place. And again, I can't speak for all of California, but I can definitely say that in the Bay Area, we flattened the curve within several weeks. And we really have not had the hospital admissions or the deaths that we were expecting. So I think a lot of people here, even though they're not excited about shelter in place, are still aware of the fact that it has a benefit.
So that up uptick. I mean, I've been seeing, I look at on the New York Times, the graphs for all the states every week, especially places where I know people. And my sister and my wife's family lives in San Francisco. So, so we're seeing an uptick in cases overall in the state, but you're saying like in San Francisco actually is not quite seeing that same sort of movement. Are you able to see the individual city statistics for San Francisco?
I don't see the individual statistics, but I talk to doctors at the various hospitals, and all of our experience has been roughly the same. We just haven't had the ICU admissions. We haven't had the cases, the deaths that we were expecting. The tricky thing about California is it's a very large state, and almost 40 million people live here. So we're talking about a population almost as large as Spain. And the variations across California are huge. So, a lot of people think of California and they think earthy, crunchy, liberal, but there are vast parts of the state that are actually not liberal at all.
I wish you could just blame this on Orange County, I think. I think that's probably where the problem is.
It's not just Orange County, though. There are places like, Imperial County and other places, other inland parts of the state where people have not been as careful about following the guidelines. They don't necessarily see the threat of a virus. And I think the most difficult thing is a lot of people think of this as like a common cold. And, viruses are funny. They really don't care about politics. They really don't care about anything except propagation continuing. And we don't have a treatment. We have remdesivir, which now shows benefits. We don't have a vaccine. So even if we want to reopen, we can't just reopen however we feel like it. We really need to follow guidelines more similar to what countries in the European Union are doing. But yeah, there are parts of California that are, for all intents and purposes, Texas.
Oh gosh, I have a friend in Houston who daily texts me the new number of cases every morning. Like I feel like almost every morning I'm waking up to her expressions of horror. I feel really.
I wonder what C-Dale is seeing when he walks out his door, like on the streets. Like, well, we're just sort of polling everyone we're talking to. Like, what does it look like outside? Here in Kansas City, it's very varied. If I go to Home Depot, nobody has a mask on. It's like it's 2017, right? It's crazy. Not even the employees, right? Other places are different. So what are you seeing? And Sugi, actually, I haven't asked you this. I want to hear what you're seeing too when you walk around Minneapolis.
Well, if I walk outside right now, I don't see a lot of people. And when I do see people, they are wearing masks. And the exception to that are people jogging, where they are very aware of their distance from people. But if I were to go outside right now and walk around the block without a mask, no one would pass me. Even with a mask, they would cross the street. So there's, a lot of awareness of it. I think partly because we've never had anyone here saying, oh, it doesn't matter, just do what you want. And you couldn't go to a store, or you couldn't even visit someone in the hospital if you wanted to, mask or no mask. So it is very different across the country, and that's a little bit problematic and worrisome for a lot of us in healthcare.
Yeah, I think in Minneapolis, I see not as many people, but many people wearing masks. Not as many people as I would like, but many people wearing masks. And then as you go out to the suburbs, it gets to be fewer and fewer people. And I was recently waiting for someone to make a purchase in a large chain kind of outdoorsy store with which I had been previously unfamiliar, to which I will never return. And this person came out of the store kind of like extremely irritated because they had been sort of like playing dodge essentially with a slew of unmasked customers, or even to go pick up a prescription at the Walgreens here, and there's an announcement over the PA, you're required to wear a mask in the store. And then people are not doing it. And it puts also people like the cashiers or vulnerable workers in the position of not only being on the front line of these things, but also being in the position of attempting to enforce that sort of stuff when security has not been, or enforcement of that sort of rule has not been their job. I feel really bad for them. And Whitney now has, as of, I think it was as of yesterday now in Kansas City, there's a rule that you have to wear a mask. And here there's a rule that you have to wear a mask, and clearly not everyone's doing it.
I think a lot of people here know people in healthcare, and they hear us saying things like, you need to wear a mask, you need to limit how much you go out, and they seem to be listening. I think as a radiation oncologist, what scares me the most is for roughly 2 months, most elective procedures didn't happen. So women weren't getting mammograms, people weren't getting colonoscopies. There's even a fear that there have been a lot of cardiac event deaths because people are afraid to go to the emergency room. They're dying at home. So as an oncologist, anytime you're faced with something like that, your worry is, does this mean I'm going to see people later on with more advanced disease that I now can't cure? You know, I have patients who are afraid to come to the hospital for follow-up. And I have to say things like, you know, you'll see less people here than you do at the grocery store, right? That there's virtually no one here. It's pretty empty. I have to force myself not to say it's a graveyard because no one likes to hear that expression when talking about the hospital. With writing, it's been interesting. I'm working on a novel manuscript that I actually left alone for about a year. And during the pandemic, I went back to it, and I realized after a while that I think I went back to it because there was a strange comfort in just being lost and looking at paragraphs and cutting things, honing things, doing the sentence work, that I could lose hours where I didn't have to think about this virus. I at first thought that it was just doctors, but I've learned by talking to other people that virtually no one sleeps through the night anymore. So if I can find, 4 hours to just play with words, it's actually been kind of a huge relief to have that.
That's really interesting. The thing about insomnia, that does seem like really pervasive. And then also hearing you talk about the anxiety of going to the hospital. Whitney knows this. I had a fall like maybe a couple weeks ago at this point, and I fell and I bruised a bone in my scaphoid bone. And it's like a small bone in your hand, and it can turn into, if you don't treat it, arthritis or whatever. And my dad is a doctor, and I called him and I was like, can I avoid going to the doctor? And I held up my hand to FaceTime, and he could see that it was blue. And he was like, you have to go. And I was terrified. And I went to the hospital, and the social distancing was so good. Yes. I was kind of blown away by how well the University of Minnesota's hospitals and clinics were taking care of that. I felt totally safe. And I had been freaked out for months about going to the doctor.
I find myself going to sleep earlier because I'm already anxious about not getting enough sleep. So, whereas I might binge watch, beachfront bargain hunt, I just don't do that because I'm worried that I won't get enough sleep. And so I go to bed, and then I wake up multiple times during the night. Usually one of the times I wake up in full sweat, anxious. It's almost, I actually wrote a poem that was published in the San Francisco Chronicle about this, that response, that adrenaline response, so many of us in healthcare, we can't turn it off because everyone is anxious. So we spend all of our days trying to make people less anxious, but that in and of itself makes us anxious.
Now that you've mentioned that, the poem, could you read it for us?
Sure. Adrenaline. God of panic, God of safety, you who gifted us this chemical to ensure in a moment's notice we can fight or flee, I come now to plead mercy. The small fruits you left above our kidneys now refuse to stop firing off their messages. Night after night, I cannot calm myself. These glands meant to protect me now, keeping me on high alert. When I fall into dream, I am again at the hospital, walking the long path toward the double doors. And as in waking life, the question rises, will this be the day I get infected? Even in sleep, I am managing my patient's panic. I come now to ask for even one night's relief. Let me slumber long enough to find myself at the end of the dock, the blue Caribbean, the only thing in front of me. Let me sit pretending to fish when all I am doing is studying the myriad shades of blue I took for granted for so long. Let the man I love come check on me, come kiss me on the back of my neck. Just for one night, let there be no virus, nothing to worry about except rain clouds advancing.
Oh, that's so perfect. Thank you so much. I feel like that captures this very specific, unending, restless feeling. I mean, I can't imagine what it's like to be a physician at this time, but even my own restless heart, I feel like that's really beautifully articulated. Thank you. You wrote The Affliction long before we'd ever heard of COVID. And yet, for me, as I read it, there were a lot of moments in the book that chime with our current circumstance. I was thinking of Between Men, which is about a man who's choosing to die alone, not of COVID, but of cancer. And I wonder if you could also read that, and maybe we can talk about these two texts together.
Orange juice and sparkling wine. What more could one desire for breakfast? Each morning, Link drank a cup of instant coffee and then filled a tumbler with ice, followed by a quarter glass of orange juice and the remaining 3/4 of the glass with sparkling wine. The walk to the beach then followed. On some days, he would even forego the coffee. There were times when he would stay at the beach for hours. On other occasions, he would walk around for 15 minutes and then walk home. He saw some of the same people at the beach almost daily. There was the old man who always wore pastel blues and pinks and sat on a rotting bench eating a bagel each morning. He was a man of few expressions. There was glum and glummer with only a mild change in his face as he ate the bagel. And there was the Chinese woman who did stretches and quick jabbing movements with her hands, jabbing at the air as if at birds only she could see, birds attacking her. There was the homeless man who wandered aimlessly, muttering something about cats and cleanliness. There was the young woman briskly walking her small dog, a dog that always appeared better groomed than she did, at least 4 pink or red ribbons in its fur, as if the mane on its head were in fact a hairstyle. The sun would be far behind them all. On the other side of the city, there would be light in the sky, but no sun. The sand would be a filthy gray dotted with trash, but at least the trash changed daily. The ocean would be there with its insistent noise and smell, and at least there was this one constant. Link knew what he would find at the beach. He knew what each day brought, and each morning on his walk, he wondered if his final day had come, if that was the day, the very one. Some people, when faced with death, find themselves possessed with an undeniable urge to do things, to do everything they had ever wanted to do, but had never found the time. They travel to distant lands, they jump off bridges into murky water, they rappel down cliffs, fly in helicopters, dive in shark-infested waters, venture out on walking safaris in the bush, hoping to hear the lion's unmistakable grumbling roar. They live and live dangerously because they know they are about to die. But Link was not one of those people. Honestly, neither am I. Link wanted to die privately. He was absolutely certain about this. He wanted to die alone. He wanted to disappear the way an actor playing the Buddha might in an old movie. It has taken me a long time, but I actually admire this about Link when I think of him now. But back then, I did not understand any of it. "Hey man, you okay?" I said to Link. I could tell he had almost no idea what I had said to him. He turned around and stared at me with that odd expression on his face, to which I would over time become quite accustomed. "I've seen you out here before. Man, you almost walked into that garbage can." "Oh, sorry, I was just thinking, sorry." "No problem, man. I do that sometimes too. I'm Diego." "Diego." "Hi, Diego, Diego." Link was always amazed at the way Americans could just strike up conversations, how they always seemed to want to talk. Link believed that silence bothered Americans, and yet I was the first person who had spoken to him at the beach. Link mumbled a few more things and said he had to get going. On the way home, Link must have wondered why I had talked to him. Later, he told me how once home, he had gone out on the patio, sat in his single lounge chair, and fallen asleep. When he woke up, it was already late afternoon, time to return to the beach. On the walk to the beach then, Link noticed the creamsicle-colored blooms of the hibiscus in various yards. He wondered why anyone would plant such hideous plants with their gaudy display of intermittently disturbing the hedges. He could hear the crackling of the telephone wires overhead once he made the turn toward the beach. Knew that the humidity must have been fairly high that afternoon. Slowly, he found himself filled with anxiety that I would still be there at the beach. He was worried that maybe even someone else might talk to him, and so he stopped, turned around, and walked back home. Do I trust the story? Do I trust the way he recalled things? Not really. You know I don't trust the way many of these things are recalled. But memory is always like this. I don't pretend it can be any other way. I stopped pretending a long time ago.
Thank you very much. There's so many interesting, like even just from the poem that you read, when you're thinking about, is this the moment of that I'm going to get infected? And he's thinking, he has that anxiety. Is this the moment someone's going to talk to me, if I'm remembering the passage right? Right. Those things are parallel, but also that passage to me is the way that I feel when I'm jogging through the city now. Like I see people at a distance, I'm watching them. I don't want them to talk to me. I don't, I don't want them to interact with me. And yet there's this kind of pervasive sort of loneliness of that, movement through the city that feels like what I think it's like for most people to walk through the city now. I know that, you obviously weren't predicting that there was going to be a pandemic, although you did call the book The Affliction, which always is kind of interesting to me. But I do believe that art, committed, act of writing can sometimes sense things that aren't totally manifest in reality yet, but might be on its way. Do you ever feel that way?
I don't know if I feel it in quite that way. I think there are different traditions. And if you look at an Anglo or Germanic tradition, people have been conditioned to think of time as linear. And if you look at other traditions, if you look at, say, the Vedic tradition from India or some of the pre-Columbian traditions of South America, they don't see time that way. They see it as something cyclical.
Or Juan Rulfo's book, Pedro Páramo, which is a really interesting
It's a book I love,
book.
and
yeah,
was a huge influence on me. But the thing that is interesting is that if you're within a cyclical tradition of time, everything has happened before and everything will happen again. And so, I am old enough to have lived through a different pandemic. I'm watching people die.
Yeah.
And I'm sure whether I consciously or subconsciously do it, I draw from things that I've experienced in my life. And it can seem in a moment like this as if it's predictive, but it's that there are only so many emotions we feel as human beings, and there's only so many things that we face as human beings. And I'm not going to be Russian and say to be human is to suffer, but to be human is to experience certain things over and over again. So I think some of what you sense is that fear or anxiety about mortality is something many people live with. I'm always amazed when I meet people who practice some of the Eastern religions like Buddhism, and they say that they've just let everything go. And I just think, how does one do that? How do I sign up? How do I know that it won't work for me? But, I do think that the job of any good writer or artist is to pay attention. And if you're paying attention and you're trying to capture the world for someone else, or a facet of the world, or how one sees the world, these works that you produce always become larger than anything that you can do. So I think some of what you're feeling is that.
C. Dale, we want to thank you for being on the show with us and for your writing and your work with patients. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we'd also like to remind our listeners to go out and pick up The Affliction or any one of C. Dale's terrific poetry collections. Thanks again.
Thank you.